I speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So yesterday, as you may have heard, was a busy day. It was actually my first time at an electoral synod. So it was an educational experience for me, you might say. We arrived at St. Paul's Bloor Street before 9:30 in the morning with a view to electing 3 bishops suffragan. We managed to accomplish that task just before 7 o'clock in the evening. So it was near 10 hours of balloting. And on my way in, I had a question in my mind about the intersection between good, faithful discernment, listening to the Spirit, discerning what is good for the church. And then on the other hand, of course, the political process that we see at work, that's sometimes not exactly what we would like to see as true of our church. How do these things intersect in the midst of this big, complicated episcopal election? One of the things that stood out to me, though, was that over and over and over again, in each of the 3 elections, there were candidates very much like our own Canon Stephen, who had good support, who could have made a case to stay in the race a little longer, but who withdrew their names and made sure that the final ballots came down to only 2 candidates who had been leading. I think the reason for that was because this election wasn't about personal ambition for these candidates. It was about truly discerning the will of the Spirit and the will of the church. And that, my friends, is an admirable thing. And I think one of the reasons that resonated with me is I had been meditating on this very challenging parable from the Gospel of Luke, wondering what to make of this notion of dishonest wealth, the children of light, the children of this generation. What does all of this mean? And so what I saw before me on the floor of electoral synod resonated in some ways with what Jesus is saying. And let's be honest here, this is one of those parables that we try to avoid, right? There's actually a tradition in the church of just dodging the parable entirely and skipping right to the end where Jesus says you can't serve 2 masters, because that's easier, right? We are already uncomfortable when we come to parables or sayings of Jesus that deal with wealth. They tend to make us squirm. If you're anything like me, we try to find ways around them. And then you add on top of it the confusing features that this parable has, and nobody would blame us for running for the hills. But instead, I think maybe it's worth sticking it out and seeing what we can make of it. I'll be honest though, I started to try to run the other way when I was meditating on this passage. And then I ran across one of my favorite commentators, Father Robert Capon, who writes on the parables. And he said that this particular passage is so challenging and so strange that we can't do away with it. We can't just come up with some reason why the text should be interpreted differently, or maybe it was translated poorly, or so on. It's just too particularly like what Jesus would say that we have to grasp, we have to grapple with it. So a manager is hauled in before his master. And the master says, "I've heard a rumor that you've been mismanaging my wealth." And it seems that the manager doesn't really get much of a chance to respond, so we don't really know if it's true or not. But then he goes on to do exactly what he's been accused of doing. He calls people in front of him and he says, "Let's just write down your debt. Let's just make sure you get to keep more of whatever it is that you have accumulated for yourself." And we might wonder if these people who owe these resources, this money, if they're poor themselves, if they are humble farmers working in an oppressive system where they're under all kinds of pressures, maybe there are good reasons why they needed to have those debts reduced. We don't really know. That doesn't seem to be the focus of the parable. And then oddly, the master who was going to dismiss this manager for mismanaging his wealth, he actually commends him for doing the very thing he's not supposed to be doing. And then Jesus says something about how we need to deal with dishonest wealth so as to store up rewards in eternal homes. He uses words like children of light, children of this generation, and it's all a bit odd. What to do with all of this? I think whatever else we might say about this parable, we can be sure that Jesus is talking about real money, real wealth, the things that we like to accumulate to make ourselves feel comfortable. And I think we can be sure that Jesus is not saying that anything goes. I think we can be sure that Jesus isn't saying that the goal in life is to accumulate as much as possible. Have you seen that bumper sticker that says, "Whoever dies with the most toys wins"? I think we can be pretty comfortable that Jesus is disagreeing with that sentiment. Maybe one of the reasons that this parable is so challenging is that it actually serves to disorient us, to turn the expected world upside down. Sometimes we tell ourselves a story in which we work and we earn, and because we have worked hard for what we have, we deserve it. You heard people talk like this before? Maybe you've said these things before. I know I have. I worked hard for that. I shouldn't have to give it up. Maybe there's a new tax or a new program proposed where other people are going to get some of the money that we've earned. And we might say those people should get jobs. They should work for what they get because I should get. But Jesus seems to be saying maybe that's not quite how the kingdom of heaven works. Instead, Jesus seems to be suggesting that there is this thing called dishonest wealth. And it begs the question, is there any other kind? And I think if we tell ourselves a story in which we generate our own wealth, we make ourselves into the people that we are, we own and we deserve the things that we are given, well then in that case there is only dishonest wealth. Because even though the work that we put in is important, even though the way that we live our lives is of great value, the truth is none of us made ourselves. You and I, we didn't create the world around us. We didn't create the givenness of things. We didn't ask for our gifts or our skills or our abilities or our circumstances or our lives. And so some of us are better off than others, and some people around the world are better or worse off than we are. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of order to it. Jesus is not saying here that everybody gets what they deserve. Instead, he seems to be saying that there is a system in the world that we can live into that can either be good or not. We can give to the benefit of others, or we can shore up wealth for ourselves. We actually get to choose those things, and God doesn't micromanage who it is that gets one thing or another. And so this dishonest manager can stumble accidentally upon something that looks like the kingdom when he starts to rearrange his master's fortune in a way that doesn't directly benefit him. He's looking for a benefit down the road. He's hoping that these people will come to help him later on. But he doesn't skim money off the top and put it in his own pocket. He redistributes his master's wealth. He does something that is not as much good for him as it is good for other people. And so he acts as though the money that has been entrusted to him isn't really his, as though he doesn't need to account for it anymore because that's where he finds himself. And I think that is what Jesus praises. And so, my friends, what would happen, I wonder, if we acted as though the wealth that we have been given individually and as a Christian community here at Holy Trinity, if we acted as though that wealth was dishonest wealth, wealth that we didn't have to account for, wealth that isn't really ours. I wonder what would happen if, in the face of prudent investment strategy or insurance risk or building maintenance issues or prudent planning, if in the face of all of that, if we instead acted generously, seeking the benefit of others even when it's not clear that that's going to come back to help us. I wonder what that might look like. And my friends, that's a challenging thing. I tell you truly, I struggle with this perhaps more than anything else when we work through the gospel teachings. But if we come together and lean into this, if we don't turn away from the tough challenging, but dig in and seek to learn collectively, to discern what dishonest wealth might mean, then it may just be that we too can catch a glimpse of the kingdom. And so may we know that we have not made ourselves, that even though we work and we struggle, what we have doesn't really belong to us. May we seek not so much to build up our own fortunes, but to give selflessly, endlessly, sacrificially, so that others around us might benefit and we might see something of that eternal kingdom that Jesus promises us that we shall inherit, whether we deserve it or not. Amen.